speakers. One that you had already the opportunity to meet this morning, also through a vivid little movie that was shown by Michaela, who is Denisa-Elena Ionete. Ionete. I'm really sorry for the pronunciation. I know how important it is to pronounce properly family names. She is the head of unit of the Fragile and Crisis Management Unit, A5 within DEFCO, and will give a presentation on the development part of crisis, conflict and fragility. I would like to hand over the floor now to our next speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Marcus for this very visionary introduction, which makes my work much easy in because indeed you answered the most important question, why fragility is today so high in our agenda. And early discussions with the colleagues from the security community were also very relevant. For example, when asking why Mali, who was a donor darling for a number of years, and Mali was not only a donor darling, but it was a country where we all thought that our development approaches were successful. What was more successful in bringing young kids basic services like immunization, like nutrition, like the famous Bamako initiative? What was better than the famous initiative on education for all, which increased considerably the enrollment in primary school of kids and especially of girls? And like this, for less informed, it was sudden, but yes, it appeared to the public opinion that it was sudden, and that country fell in a sort of backlash, which certainly impacts its development, but moreover the rights of the people in that country. So the answer is maybe there, that we have to change our approaches, we have to be visionary and to answer the real challenges, which may be different than the ones we have perceived until now. Next slide. Let me start by Let me start by providing you a couple of figures on the aid and development cooperation, because indeed, for the last years we have moved from aid to development. The EU collective official development assistance spending in 2011 was 53.1 billion euros. This means European institutions and the member states, while the total spending of OECD, the traditional donors, was in US dollars 133,523. That means with the conversion to the euro, it's that we are providing a huge part of the world development aid. But it's not only the development aid that contributes to the development of a country, which can be put at profit for getting it on a sustainable path, or on the opposite, can get it down into the conflict and to the poverty. There are also the remittances, the foreign direct investment, the trade, and the domestic revenues. And there is also the famous policy coherence for development, on which we here in the European Union are very, very much conscient that some of our internal policies may have a certain impact on the third countries. There is a strong concern for making the aid more effective, and this was underlined in international fora, starting with Rome in 2003, then in Paris 2005, and in Accra in 2008, where a number of principles for aid effectiveness were clearly underlined, and I'm sure most of you know them. It is about harmonization, it is about mutual accountability, it is about ownership by the partner country, it is about alignment on its priorities, and so on. But why the fragile states, and what are the fragile states? You heard a bit earlier this morning, practically the fragile states, you can see the definition on the board. The fragile states are the states that cannot function efficient enough for their citizens, and they cannot ensure the accomplishment of their rights. They maybe lack the ability or the political will to develop this relation with their own society, and as a consequence, they are unable to carry out the basic state of functions for governing a population. But, and I would like to underline, because this is very important, the functioning and the governing of a population for the interests and the rights of that population. The definition, as you may imagine, leaves a sort of flu, and this is why there may be several lists. For example, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has its list. Also, the World Bank and African Development Bank have their own list. We in the European Commission, we have what we call a crisis declaration list. And this is a list of the countries where, for a number of reasons, we apply what we call the flexible procedures for the implementation. And in the next slide, you can see an overview of what we understand through the fragile and crisis countries. But of course, these lists are just a sort of macro approach, because practically what happens in a country differs very much from another. Next slide. Look into this, the countries listed in that list. We are very proud that our development assistance goes to more than half to these fragile and crisis countries. And in fact, it's since last year that we are counting, in fact, our disbursements to fragile states, because when you look back at the statistics, for example, at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, their statistic end in 2009, where we just have started counting this in 2011, and we are doing better, however, in regard to 2002, the champions of the 2009. Next slide. As a relative ratio from 2010 to 2011, you can see on the board, this ratio increased by about 10%. But, next slide, more than half of the aid to the fragile and crisis countries goes to 10 countries, as you can see, and amongst them it's the Palestinian territories, Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Pakistan, these countries in which we are witnessing not only extreme poverty and instability, but also severe conflicts, long-run, frozen conflicts, or cycles of conflict where the violence breaks and goes down and breaks again. Next slide. But what are thus the features of these fragile and conflict-affected states? I think you, after this description, you do not need to look too much on the board. First of all, they witness cycles, repetitive cycles of violence. They witness natural resource course. I don't know who mentioned, speaking about the Democratic Republic of Congo, that it's a geological scandal. So countries which have resources, but they have a problem on managing them. Vulnerability to internal and external shocks. This is the case, for example, of the two African regions that you have mentioned also in the earlier discussion, Sahel and Horn of Africa, where the drought, it's the cycle, the repetitive cycle of the drought fragilizes even more the structures. There are countries where there is a breakdown of social contract, and remember now the definition when we said that these countries do not have the capacity to govern for the interest of the citizens, and that's a good example, and I'm sure you can name all of these countries. The international community agreed on 10 principles for engaging in fragile states. And they are very revelatory if you start with the first one, which is context is the starting point. So in these countries, we cannot have a checklist, but rather a la carte menus for intervention. The second is very important, do not harm. This means that every intervention should be assessed in its context, in the sense that sometimes we can do worse with the best intention to do good things. But maybe I would insist on the third principle, which is state building as a central objective, And here I would again remind the link with the definition. State building means creating these states which govern for the citizens and not for themselves. And of course, you can go through the remaining 7 principles which underline, amongst others, political, security and development objectives linked. This is very, very important. That's all the discussion today and in the coming days. Next slide. 2 years ago, an assessment on how the international actors engage in these fragile states was done. And then surprisingly, among these 10 principles, only one was broadly on track. And this was the principle on promoting the non-discrimination as a basis for inclusive and stable societies. But 4 of them were practically off track. And unfortunately, the second principle, do not harm, is among those on which we did not achieve too much. The second principle in which we are off track is practical coordination mechanism between international actors. Then the next one, as you can see, long-term engagement. Long-term engagement is a challenge. And the 4th one, avoiding pockets of exclusion. Next slide. To give you a better view on the economic dynamics in these states, you can see here a diagram which depicts the growth in fragile states. And you can see that over the last practically 10 years, today most of them are practically worse than they were before, in the sense that those who were fuel exporting have gone below the level where they were in 2001, while the non-fuel mineral exporters are also below that level, and only the others, so which rely, to say so, more on themselves than on any other natural resources, are doing slightly better and have an average growth increase of something between 8 and 9%. Maybe this is an illustration of the do not harm principle, in the sense that it's obvious that countries who had strong resources were not able to capitalize on them, maybe because not enough was done on one hand to help them get better management of those resources, but also to use them for their own citizens. And of course, the discussion can continue. Next slide, please, depicts another fact. But with a warning, this is the situation of today. The diagram depicts on the x-axis the GDP per capita, and then on the y-axis you have the life expectancy, and you have the different dots colored in yellow or in fuchsia, which mark the states. In yellow, the fragile states, and in fuchsia, the non-fragile one. As you can see, most of the fragile states are in the category of low-income countries, but I would like to draw your attention among the few who are in the middle-income countries. This is obvious that it is an even greater challenge to make sure that these countries get back on track, in the sense that for the fragile states, the development aid can help, but for the medium-income countries, the development aid only represents a small part of their income, their total resources. So we can leverage only very few in the actual conditions. Thus, the need to be more strategic and to be rather catalysts than an input. The next slide, I leave it also to you as a sort of reference, because it puts together the European framework for fragility, conflict prevention, and peace building. And you have there the different institutions and their main policy and political framework for addressing fragility, conflict, and peace building. And from that very complicated slide, I would just like to remind you that the fragility, the conflict are for a long time on the agenda of the European institution. And in 2007 was adopted the first communication and council conclusions relevant for the fragility. But since 2001, with the Gothenburg Council conclusions on conflict prevention, the European Union is seized by the matter of the need to prevent conflicts rather than to address them, and later on the link between conflict, fragility, security, and development. Let me insist a bit on the New Deal, because this is an element which has not been for a long time in the radar screen. It emerged 1 year ago in Busan, but this is the new way of engaging in fragile states, putting the peace building and the state building at the core. And the big difference with all other approaches, because you will tell me, yes, this issue with harmonization, with ownership, we heard them for some years, and then for almost 10 years we hear about. What really makes a difference here is the engagement of the fragile states themselves. And maybe this is the element with which we have to count. We may not see it so clearly, but this is what makes a difference. We would say here the fragility aficionados, to the same extent to which the emerging economies start playing a role on the international arena and in the political relations. Indeed, it is the will of 17 of these fragile states who have acknowledged the status of fragility, who have acknowledged that they need to build the states in the sense of building states for their own citizens, and who have created all these dynamics. And this is how the New Deal has been developed. Next slide, please. With the 3 pillars that you can see there: the goals, the focus, and the trust. The focus and the trust are the acronyms of the issues which are dealt with under each of the pillar, while the goals are the 5 peace building and state building goals that you see there: legitimate politics, security, justice, economic foundation, and revenues and services. In fact, the New Deal encapsulates the vision of achieving the peace building and state building goals, the terms of engagement between the donor community, between the international actors and the fragile states themselves, and also the modalities to deliver this support. Next slide, please. There is no need to go to this slide. It describes in detail the peace building and state building goals. Next slide. Neither through the next one, which presents together the fragile states and the international actors, the international donors, multilateral and bilateral, who have signed up for this new approach. But I would like you to look at the next slide, which depicts the 10 countries who have really taken the lead in putting this in practice. And I'm very proud that the European Union, together with France, is pioneering the pilot of the New Deal in the Central African Republic. And this is one of the reasons for which you will not see me tomorrow, because I have to go to Paris to discuss to our French colleagues some practical details on the next steps. What is the future of this fragility agenda? Not too much to say, because Marcus has underlined already most of the elements of the future 15 years. But I would like to underline 3 things. First of all, their very, very strong commitment and seriousness and engagement. These countries believe in the fact that the New Deal is the approach to follow to get out of the conflict of the fragility. Second, this process has practically 2 tracks. First of all is the engagement in the political process of the post-2015, making sure that this agenda of the fragility is rolled into the post-2015. But at the same time, this is not only empty political statement, this is also a hard work behind, which is in setting the necessary policy and methodological guidance, like, for example, indicators for the peace building and state building goals, like, for example, monitoring systems and results framework, the framework for the transition compact that you have heard Marcus mentioning. So again, and this will certainly ensure success, because if it's to compare with the Millennium Development Goals, that was also the case. It was a framework which is still valid, but behind it, with the Millennium Project, with Jeffrey Sachs, it also had the necessary evidence-based methodology and policy to be put in practice. And we have to support the G7 plus countries to succeed. From the donors group in INCAF, the focus is now increasingly on moving from policy to practice. We have developed all these concepts. Now the time is to put them in practice and to engage to support the New Deal. Next slide. And here comes the most important thing. If we want to succeed, the success in these countries, in the fragile states, is the success of the overall international community. And we can only succeed if there is a corporate action by all development actors and by all external action stakeholders. I anticipate already saying that you will hear during the coming days what we here in the European Union we are doing. Of course, every single donor is doing a similar process in refocusing its cooperation and development cooperation in the countries where there is a need, in adopting the necessary methodology. But the success will not be only on how we will succeed individually, but how we will corporately, we will be able to work and to work with the G7 plus country. Another challenge, of course, is the role of the emerging donors. Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, China, South Africa. They are not the traditional actors of the development aid, but they are actors on the ground. I think that most of you who have worked in the field know very well the Chinese presence in countries like, for example, Africa, in the countries in crisis, and you can give all the examples. This is another challenge. The emergence of medium-income fragile states, it's maybe not for today, but it will be in the close future, certainly, when most of these countries will manage to get a sort of economic output, but not enough to meet the rights and the needs of their citizens. Here comes the point in making sure that aid becomes not an input only, but becomes really a catalyst for change, a catalyst for building the peace and building the states in these countries. And of course, the effectiveness of aid, meaning flexibility, capacity, resources. But the bottom line is to walk this talk, and this talk we can walk it only if we have people who have the skills and the capacity to work together. Hence the idea of this course, for which we are very grateful to have you all here. And thank you very much. Look forward to your questions, and especially to the coming 3 days when hopefully we will find corporately more engagement and maybe new solutions for today's problems. Thank you very much.